Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Elizabeth Nugent. She is an assistant professor of political science, and her research explores the political psychology of religion and repression in the Middle East. Professor Nugent uses a variety of survey, voting, archival, and interview evidence in her work and incorporates a mixture of methodologies to analyze this data. Today we'll talk with Professor Nugent about her book project, After Repression, Identity and Polarization in Democratic Transitions. Welcome, Professor Nugent.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's begin with an overview of your book project. Tell us about it.
Great. So the book project looks both historically at the development of polarization under the previous regimes in Egypt and Tunisia, and also looks at how polarization during the transitions affected kind of two aspects of the transitions. Again, I'm talking about, after 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings, kind of the level of effective polarization, so how much the actors who were in charge of negotiating these very important transitions, how much they liked each other, how much they could, get along. And then preference polarization, which had to do with different, opinions and positions about things like the Constitution, transitional justice, kind of these core aspects of democratic transitions.
Okay.
And what I find is that the way in which repression did or did not target these different kinds of actors that are in charge of the transition affects the level of affective and preference polarization. So it departs a little bit from, or actually quite a bit from, much of the literature, which looks at democratic transitions, or polarization in democratic settings, where there's not that same level of polarization, repression. And so it's a new theory in many ways, looking at the ways in which the repression that defines authoritarian regimes conditions, patterns of polarization and preference formation.
Okay, and let's define the term polarization just so we're all on the same page.
Right. So the way that I use it in my book, it has these two aspects, so affective polarization and then preference polarization. And I think of these things as the extent to which groups like each other, how they get along, and then the extent to which groups disagree on matters of substance. So this comes more out of the literature in American politics, where there is this differentiation between affective polarization, where there's something about feelings towards an outgroup, and then preferences. And what I find is both are really important. Even if you have agreement and hate each other, it's sometimes hard to compromise. If you really like each other but disagree quite a bit, it's also hard to compromise.
Right.
So these two different aspects end up being really important in tandem.
And what led you to write the book?
Yeah, so I started graduate school in 2011. I'd been traveling to the Middle East and working on the Middle East since 2005 as an undergraduate. I went to Cairo for a summer, and it kind of changed the course of my life. At the time, what was happening was called in hindsight, it's been called the Cairo Spring. So there was this uptick in mobilization, people demanding certain democratic rights, and the Egyptian state responded quite heavy-handedly to this. And since then, the way in which authoritarian regimes and the repressive environment affect political actors has been an interest of mine. When I started my dissertation in 2011, 2012, I was interested in polarization. I hadn't quite connected it with this interest in repression yet, but the more that I went back to Egypt, I started working in Tunisia, the conversations I was having with people really focused on this idea of joint victimhood or, singular victimhood, depending on the country. In Egypt, you have a case where the Muslim Brotherhood, was targeted much worse than other opposition groups. In Tunisia, you have what I call a widespread repressive environment. Everyone was in jail together, everyone was in exile together. And these stories just started emerging where this was clearly foundational to what came later.
Okay. And so why Tunisia and why Egypt?
Yeah, so this is always a big question in political science, how you choose your cases.
Yes.
And my colleagues and I sometimes joke, sometimes you just really like the country. So Egypt, I have a soft spot for. It's been the place I studied Arabic. I spent quite a bit of time there before I started my PhD. But Egypt and Tunisia were the first two Arab Spring cases to go, essentially. So a long-term dictator in Tunisia resigned in January 2011. In February 2011, the long-term dictator in Egypt resigned. And in many ways, they had very similar starts. They were early cases. There was unprecedented mass mobilization. These two dictators resign. And then within 3 years, they were in very vastly different situations. So Tunisia was holding a next round of elections. It's passed the constitution. It still has major security issues, and democratization is not an easy process, but it was continuing down that path. And in Egypt, there was a coup and almost a complete reversion back to authoritarianism. Right. So the combination of the similarities at the beginning and the divergent path made it the kind of puzzle you want to try to explain. Sure.
So I'm curious about your methodology. Did you use the same techniques in both countries, or did you mix it up? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the main methodology is based quite a bit on qualitative evidence. So this includes over 120 interviews that I did with members of the opposition in both Egypt and Tunisia. In Egypt, it was a little bit more difficult. In Tunisia, I went to the country. I was there for about 6 months doing these interviews. It's not a particularly large country, so between Tunis and some of the major cities, I was able to get a good representative sample of the people I wanted to talk to. And I found people quite open to talking about how their experiences of prison and exile had shaped them.
Both men and women, or primarily men?
Mostly men, just as a function of who was in politics. Sure. Although there is quite a bit of interesting work coming out about wives of politicians who were also repressed kind of as an extension of their husband, and then also female activists who had been working under the previous regime. In Egypt, because of the coup, most of the Muslim Brotherhood members have either been arrested or have fled to different parts of the country, and so I did of the globe, and so I did interviews in Istanbul and London to try and get again a representative sample of the kinds of people that I was interested in.
Right. How did you find them in Turkey and the other places?
Yeah, so having worked on the Brotherhood and Islamists more generally for a couple of years now, it was kind of starting with one person and then what might be called a snowball sample, where they introduce you to other people.
Right.
I contacted a few lawyers. I, blind tweeted at people to see if they were available. But I think one thing that I felt as I was doing the work was that once I had a positive experience with someone where, they felt like their story was being listened to, they were then more likely to recommend, someone else, a friend or a colleague, do an interview with me as well to get more of the story. I think people like to be listened to. I think they like to matter. And these were extremely traumatic, formative experiences. And, what I think is great about, the way that the book has kind of played out is that it highlights those experiences of suffering and puts some kind of meaning onto it. So I think that was part of why it ended up being maybe easier than I thought, although it was not easy.
Right. Okay.
But once, one person had a good experience, they were willing to recommend me to someone else.
So I'm curious, based on your research, did you find similar things in both countries, or were they different in some way?
Yeah, so they ended up being different. So in Tunisia, as I mentioned, the way that the previous regime, the Ben Ali regime, had repressed its opposition was what I call in the book a widespread repressive environment. So, communist, Islamist, leftists of different sorts, centrist, anyone who was opposition, was working in opposition to the regime, would be arrested and targeted. And so you end up with very different kinds of people, very representing different kinds of groups in jail together, in exile together. Quite a few of them ended up in France and other European countries. There's also just a similarity of experience. So even if, an Islamist and a communist aren't in jail together, they were probably in very similar circumstances. Their families suffered in the same way. And what I find is that creates some kind of, collective identity that bridges across these different opposition identities. In Egypt, it's a different story. So the Mubarak regime really just targets the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
And it's not to say that there isn't repression of other groups, but the Brotherhood certainly gets it worse and more consistently worse.
And why do you think that is?
Yeah, so that's a big question, I guess, of endogeneity, as we call it in political science. I'm now working on a project with 2 other researchers at Yale looking at basically this question: why do regimes repress in different ways? And we look at colonial investments and kind of, pre-independence investments in things like the police and the military, which seem to have these long-term downstream effects. But the idea is that, depending on what you inherit in terms of intelligence or police capabilities, determines how you can repress. So, the British system really leaves the Egyptians with the ability to distinguish between real and non-real threats. As a result, they can kind of economize and target the group that's actually a threat.
Okay.
The French system ends up leaving in place a very diffuse and maybe not so effective, intelligence agency and institutions that are really spying on each other rather than their opposition. And so you end up with an intelligence agency that can't distinguish between real and fake threats. So it's kind of, everybody ends up being repressed.
Right.
So that's a little bit beyond what the book talks about, but it's always the logical question of why is this different?
Right.
And I think it's a really interesting question too.
So I'm curious, when you're doing the research and talking to people, what kind of questions are you asking them?
Yeah, so
because it seems, very, emotionally driven kind of questions.
Right. And I should say these are long interviews, so it's not something where I show up at someone's house and ask them, so tell me about the time you were tortured.
Right.
What I try to do is start with basically the beginning of their political lives. So how did they get interested in politics? A lot of times it has to do with a personal experience or their parents. And it's probably, 30 to 45 minutes into a conversation about the narrative they want to tell me of their life that then we get into some of these, more difficult experiences. So yeah, starting with, how did you get involved? Often something will come up. I was arrested, when I was politically active in college, or, this happened to me when I was young, and that kind of opens the door to starting to ask about that. And then, what's interesting too is that once that door is open and once you've started talking about kind of personally interesting things, they're also more willing to talk about some of these other effects. So the effects on their wives, the effects on their children, the way in which their friendships were changed. So most of these interviews were quite long, 3-4 hours, in people's homes, in places where they felt comfortable to talk about this kind of, deeply personal experience.
Okay, and based on your research, what are the implications for Tunisia and Egypt?
Yeah, so the immediate implication was, the divergence we currently see in Egypt and Tunisia. So Tunisia, as I mentioned, was capable of bringing together its old opposition. They passed a new constitution. It did take 3 years, but they did it. They held first elections. They've now held municipal elections. There's another set of elections scheduled for next year. So, by political science standards, they're doing all the things you need to do to get to the next stage of democratic consolidation. In Egypt, it's a completely different story. Again, there was a coup. There's been a reversion to authoritarianism. And so the book links experiences of repression to these developments through polarization.
Okay.
So, a widespread repressive regime made a case where there was less polarization. They were more willing and able to work together on these important decisions. Whereas in Egypt, you have this targeted repressive environment. There was just never that same level of cooperation or agreement, and it's really devolved since 2013, since the coup. The Brotherhood at this point is banned as a terrorist organization. As I mentioned, quite a few of their members are in jail at this point. I think up to 40,000 members. So, what I find interesting is how these things are really linked to the historical legacies of the authoritarian period.
Right. I'm just thinking about Egypt in particular and how the Brotherhood was specifically targeted. And I'm wondering if that has a chilling effect on other groups in Egypt saying, hey, if we tried to uprise or form together a group, that they would, the regime would crack down on them as they did on the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think there's any kind of thing like that going on?
Yeah. At the moment, there's definitely a chilling effect. The current regime, I think, has broken out of even the mold of, previous authoritarian regimes in Egypt. Last year, during the 2018 presidential elections, it arrested all candidates running against the president, kind of departed from the targeted repressive regime as it's reconsolidating. What's interesting is that during the Mubarak period, the way that targeted repression worked was that it was also co-opting the other groups. So while it was, arresting the Brotherhood, it was also permitting the leftists to exist and publish their newspaper.
Oh, okay.
So I think they were trying to combat that a little bit by getting buy-in from leftists and secular opposition groups.
Okay. So ultimately, what do you conclude?
Yeah, so what I conclude, academically, it focuses quite a bit on the importance of, considering the legacies of repression, how this conditions political identities, and how this very specific experience of repression can polarize or bring together a political society. I don't know that I have any policy implications or conclusions more generally. Egypt is unfortunately a very sad case at this point.
Right.
And I think in Tunisia you see, as much as this mattered, my argument and polarization and experiences that created this, narrative of joint victimhood, it did matter quite a bit for that initial period, which is crucial for democratization. But it's still politics. So Tunisia continues to have its own set of issues. Friends of mine from Tunisia, when I refer to it as a success story, they're like, we still have huge economic problems, we still have security issues. So, it's a messy process, but what I try to highlight in the book is how these specific legacies are very important to consider.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Nugent and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.